Hi, everyone. I'm here today with Matt Eland, and we're going to be talking about C# 9 and the rise of functional.NET. So first off, say welcome, Matt. Thank you for taking the time to talk with me.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This is exciting.
Thanks. Do you mind telling us a little about yourself?
Sure. So I'm an instructor at Tech Elevator. We're a 14-week programming boot camp in the Northeast. We offer online education as well as kind of area-based education. I'm out of Columbus, but we have Cincinnati, Cleveland, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, a number of campuses, and a new online remote option as well throughout the country. So I teach
Awesome.
14 weeks of .NET, JavaScript, HTML, CSS, SQL, all that fun stuff, and just help people who traditionally might not get into programming just get in and get in quickly or more quickly than they would for a 4-year degree program.
That's great. Yeah, I know a lot of Tech Elevator graduates, and I've always been very impressed. Cool. So where do you want to start? Should we start talking about functional programming?
That's probably a good start.
Okay.
Imagine a number of people are not really familiar with what that means.
Okay.
Object-oriented programming. I'm not sure I can offer a wonderful explanation because there's like a lot of different nuances to functional programming. But
sure, but I guess to start, C# was mostly object-oriented. Would you agree with that?
Oh, yes, absolutely. It came about as a object-oriented, just trying to solve COM and stay competitive with Java and things like that.
Cool.
Back in the early 2000s.
Okay. Excellent. And from my perspective, I've used C# a bit, and it seems to have incorporated functional programming principles over time.
Sure.
Primarily.
Yeah, I think that main shift started back in .NET 3.5 when we started introducing link and extension methods and Lambda expressions and things like that.
Yes, great
that's
stuff.
One of my favorite parts of .NET. I just didn't know to call it functional programming until, I guess, maybe 3-4 years ago, something like that.
I like to say that link is the gateway drug to functional programming.
Link is wonderful. I love it.
Yeah, it's my favorite. So how would you kind of define functional programming in general?
So I think I can contrast it to object-oriented programming.
Great.
So object-oriented programming, you're trying to make some object that encapsulates everything about something. You're wrapping everything related to maybe a bank account, or the canonical example is a car or something like that. So you make this class and it has all these things, and you test it. It's got these getters and setters and methods and things like that. And all your application is structured around classes and classes interacting with each other. With functional programming, it's more about modules and these little functions inside of them. And the functions don't necessarily have state. Well, they don't have state, but they're pure. So they take in something and they spit out something given those inputs. So they're predictable, they're reliable, they're testable. And it's about structuring an application with these little functions. So the allure that we have, or part of the allure with functional programming, is it's very easy to take a look at a small function and understand it. It's very easy to replace it with something else if you ever want to. And it's less likely for them to have quality issues, such as null reference exceptions. If they're working with things like immutable state, so data that doesn't change on an object, they're always just taking in something and spitting out something slightly different. So it's sort of this paradigm shift in programming towards little functions with pieces of state that you can change, or you can morph and return a new version of without any other consequences.
You take in that object and you don't change that object. You essentially create a new transformation and emit that.
Yeah, and usually like functional programming languages will have like syntax that helps you do that quickly. So, for example, JavaScript, it's not necessarily a functional programming language, but we have the with keyword, so we can create like I guess it's the REST operator, but we can say, okay, it's going to be like this other object, except it's going to have these other things, or this property is going to be a little bit different. So
gotcha.
Languages like Fsharp and the like, and they have actual language keywords for those concepts, making these things a lot easier.
That's great. Cool. So tell me a little bit about C# and some of the shifts in C# over the last few releases.
Yeah, so I think about 2017, we started seeing about yearly releases of C#.
Okay.
And these releases started being a little bit different. Like a lot of the release notes, if you compare them to the prior ones, they were a lot more oriented towards functional programming concepts, and that was sort of a newer shift for C#. Like previously, it was to support the new platform operations that Microsoft was doing, like tablets and things like that, or desktop with Windows Vista and things like that. It's going back a while, but with these recent versions from C#6 onwards, it started being about, well, hey, here are these tuples, and here's how you work with this read-only state, and here's a new pattern matching syntax, and the switch expressions are different. And so you start to look at these, and it's like this looks nothing like what I started programming with back in 2001. Like this is a completely different programming language,
right?
And so it's interesting. So over time, as functional programming has gotten a little bit more mainstream, a little bit more attractive, and we've understood things like, well, maybe mutable state isn't as good as we thought it was, and maybe null reference exceptions aren't necessarily the best thing to be prone to.
Right.
The language is starting to offer you, like, you don't have to do these things, but the newer versions of it are sort of shifting to allow you to. And that's one of the things I love about .NET and Microsoft, is that it continues to stay relevant as we get into cloud computing and all these stuff. Like, hey, functional programming's here. If you want it, you can do it. Just a little bit of a tangent, but I spent like all of my last year learning Fsharp and learning functional programming through Fsharp, and which is Microsoft's sort of functional programming language inside of the .NET platform.
Excellent. Yeah. And has that affected the way that you write C#?
It does, yeah. So we have this concept in Fsharp, which is common to other programming languages, functional programming languages, which is an option. So something is either going to be null or it's not, and the compiler will actually force you to handle both options. And so I look for like the C# version of that,
right?
And I start to structure my code more as like, okay, I got a collection of things, and I'm going to be transforming them with A and B and C. And I start to even write my objects without setters anymore. It's like, okay, well, I'm just writing immutable things because I see the value of immutability. If I know an object's in a good state coming in, I know that if I make a small change or two, it gets a lot harder to predict the state. Think about the .NET date time object. You can create a new date time. It's a valid date, but you can't ever add a date without creating a new date that you can then work with. It's kind of like a string or something like that.
It's immutable by default.
Yeah. So you get this kind of a quality mentality through immutability. You start to get some interesting garbage collection problems, but that's a different conversation.
Sure. Exactly. Yeah. So that's awesome. I know. So when I was writing in C#, one of the issues I had is I wanted to do things where I was creating immutable objects, but it seemed like in some ways, particularly before C#6, the language made it difficult to do so. Like I could create a automatic property, I think that's the term, with a get set, but if I wanted it to just be a read-only property, then I had to do the longhand property syntax.
Well, they fixed that a while back where you could do it just in the constructor, but yeah.
You're absolutely right. Yeah. So that was what came through in C#6, if I remember correctly. And so that was nice when that finally came around, where essentially the language was no longer fighting me when I tried to do that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. And the big red letter feature that's coming out in C#9, well, along with .NET 5 and everything that comes with that, is this record type. So it's kind of like an alternative to a class. So instead of using the class keyword, you use a record, and it's this reference type, but it's immutable by default, and it overrides equality and get hash code. So by default, equality for an object or for a reference type is going to say, hey, is this pointing to the same memory address as this other thing? Record types, they do a lot of internal things as it's being compiled, or what the CLR handles. I'm not sure what actually handles it. But it compares it based on the properties that it has. So,
oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah.
So if it is structurally equivalent,
yes,
it is ruled to be the equals will call it equivalent.
Yeah, it's somewhat similar to duck typing in JavaScript.
Excellent. Okay.
Might be a little easier to describe it. Don't think it's exact, but it's close to understand it that way.
Gotcha. Okay.
And you still have inheritance and things like that with it, and it's just a little shorthand for people who want to work with immutable state, and they don't want to have to override get hash code, get equality, and maintain these things as you start adding and removing and changing properties.
That's fantastic. Yeah, I've definitely written a few Git hash code implementations in my day, some of which were probably suboptimal.
Every single time I've done it, I've relied on a resharper to generate it for me. So
nice.
Like I'm not touching that.
Right. Yeah.
There's tools for that.
Cool. Anything else that so what other features do you want to specifically talk about in some of the newer C# releases?
Well, there's a couple other things in C# 9 that are really exciting to me beyond record types. There is, and I don't even see it in the release notes anymore. I think I might have seen it in another article, but there's this little convenience feature where you can add an exclamation mark next to a variable name, and the method will automatically check it for null. So you don't even have to write the null check anymore. Now,
nice.
I'd prefer not to have the option of it being null. Like I prefer to work with an option type. But if I'm working with C#, that's a nice little convenience feature.
Excellent.
Yeah, C# 8 changed the way that we handle nulls, or it gave us the option to configure it. I'm trying to remember the specifics of it, but you can basically set up your application or a region of your application so that that the compiler will force you to check for null or force you to handle nulls. And
that's fantastic.
Yeah, and that's probably how it should have been to begin with. But
right.
We have this problem of we got to support all these legacy code bases, and I think Microsoft found a good solution there, a good middle ground there. The other thing I'm really excited about, and this is one of the things I love about Fsharp and the JavaScript REST operator, is that thing I mentioned earlier with the with keyword. So now we can say, I want something. It's this new my business object with a balance of 400 or whatever, right? So a slightly different version of this thing.
So it'll copy the object and replace that property with the new value.
Yeah. So
that's cool.
Yeah, it's a lot more immutable handling by default in the language, which is cool. And
so is that only for record types, or is that going to be for all types?
I can't recall. I think it may be only for record types, but I can't recall. It's just one of those things I need to get in there and play with. But I'm really excited about it because it works a lot like how I like to program in JavaScript and Fsharp. So with
the spread operator, and then you can add different properties on. Yeah, that's excellent.
But with instead of spread here.
Yeah.
The problem is too many languages,
Exactly. We know what they're like, similar concepts. So tell me a little bit about what some of these shifts mean for the language and how, this is going to affect people trying to learn the language. I know that you're going to be dealing with a lot of students learning C#. Does this make your job easier? Does it make your job harder? What's your perspective on that?
Well, it doesn't make my job easier. Or at least it doesn't make it easier much. So let me back up a little bit and talk a little bit about properties. We talked about it earlier.
Yeah.
So, when .NET, when C# came out, we had, our longhand properties where we had to say public string first name, and then we'd have to write a get with a block in there, and then we'd have to have it return underscore first name or whatever your naming convention.
Right. You define the private under backing property and all that.
And then we had a setter with at the beginning it took in we had to declare almost like a method with like a string value, and then we had to set things. And gradually we started getting these little enhancements, like we started getting the value keyword for optimizing our setters, but then we got the automatic properties, so we can say public string first name get set. So when we teach .NET, when we teach people to see .NET code bases or C# code bases more specifically, we have to sort of introduce them to all these things because they're very prevalent, and these are wrinkles that other languages like Java or JavaScript don't necessarily have. And so as we start introducing all these little convenience features, it's one more thing that somebody has to learn. You think about .NET 3.5 and link and lambda expressions and things like that. Okay, so now somebody needs to at least be aware of an extension method. You need to be aware of like the fat arrow notation for lambda expressions. There's all these little things, and .NET's been around for 19 years. Well, C# has going and counting, and the compiler has to watch for all these things. And so it's telling you, when I teach interfaces, I say, hey, the interface is like a method, only it doesn't have a body. You have a semicolon at the end. There's no body declaration.
Mm-hmm.
C# 8, I think it was, introduced the option for like a default implementation in an interface, and I think Java has it at this point as well. But now, guess what? When I show it to students, well, they're hovering over things, and it says, well, hey, it says, do I need to upgrade from C# 7.3 to C# 8? It says that, like, I don't understand this compiler error, and like these features are wonderful, and they're for people like me who like to live on the bleeding edge.
Right.
But it also makes it even more intimidating because you got to have compiler errors to look for all these things and suggestions. And are you missing this new language feature? And you're coming into a new team that's been working on a code base for 6 years, and they have old bits of code and they get new bits of code, and you need to be able to read all of it. And sure, you're not going to be able to do that on day one, but it just adds fuel to the fire of imposter syndrome. I don't know what the solution is to this, but it's just becoming monumentally harder to learn languages over time as we gain features and features and features. Now there are. Go ahead.
On the other hand, do you expect that we'll start to see certain older features kind of just fall out of vogue? I don't know if that's the correct term, but where we used to see the standard getter setter syntax where you had to write the whole thing out, and you barely ever see that anymore if it's a simple getter setter.
Yeah, that's the problem.
Sometimes you need it. Yes, sometimes you need it. So is that the trouble, is that it's all still there?
Yeah.
And it's not going to fall out of favor enough where you just can forget about it.
I look at getters and setters, and I see cases where I want a full property in some places where I need to set multiple things or update something else in a setter. I see places where I just want a very quick arrow function, like the new expression bodied members that we have in C# 7. Ultimately, people need to learn them. And they're going to see them in the real world. So I don't think there's a good explanation for it. I think that we need to start investing in better compiler errors, a better hinting on that, because as it stands, even the simplest things are very intimidating. The simplest error I can think of is not all code paths return a value. Even that is overwhelming to a new programmer just starting to learn out the language. You really do need a tour guide.
Right.
And it's hard. But on the other hand, I see Microsoft doing some cool things in C# 9. We have the whole idea of a top level statement. So if you're writing a hello world program, you no longer have to worry about static void main and args, string array and all that.
Right.
You can say, hey, using system console write line hello world, and that's all that's in your file, and it
runs.
And it runs. And
wow.
What you want it to.
That's impressive.
I'm not sure how much practical value there is in that, but there's maybe some teaching value in that.
Sure. I mean, as a person who uses JavaScript, it feels very natural to write something along those lines where the code just gets run from the top down. That's how my program is executed. Yeah. Now, I've also seen some horrible, abuses of that. So
it is JavaScript. I'm teaching it this year on Friday the 13th.
Let's be clear. Yeah.
But we also get like the new keyword in C# 9, which we had new before, but we could say new and then parentheses to call a constructor. So if we have a type on the left, like we're going to declare a new variable of a specific type, on the right we can just say equals new parentheses, and it just says, oh, I'm going to infer the type. It's almost like the opposite of the var keyword in C#.
Right, I was just thinking that. Yeah, now you're flipping it, so it's like, well, do you want to declare your type, or do you want to not declare your type?
And I think that may be a more intuitive way of introducing object creation as well. So there's pluses and minuses, but as we keep going forward, we keep adding complexity, and we make it harder and harder and harder for people to go in to the language, to start learning the language if it's their first language.
So kind of a side. Oh, go ahead, please.
I think that's about all I had on that.
Kind of a side question that came to mind. When I first started with .NET, I was using VB.NET. Is VB.NET getting any of these new features, or is it mostly C# getting most of the love now?
So I made a project, I think earlier this year, where I kind of made a timeline of all the different C#, VB, Fsharp, .NET releases over time, and I started to look at trends. And the trend that I noticed with VB is a lot of it was kind of keeping parity. keep iterating with the new features. A lot of the C# features started to be like incorporating more of what Fsharp offered as Fsharp's gained in popularity. But VB has always been sort of this kid in the back of the classroom eating glue is sort of like what I like to compare it to. I spent 9 years professionally writing VB.NET code. It's a very capable language. It's actually an intuitive one. But the problem is it's very similar to C#, and most of your examples are going to be in C#. Most of the organizations who are hiring are looking for people who write C#. So it may be that we start looking at VB.NET as a teaching language. I'm not so sure it's similar enough to C# to use it as a teaching language. But it's still a royal language. It's still getting updates. It's just not as popular or as loved.
Fair, and if it's not as popular, then there's not as much reason to give this as much attention as C#, for example.
Yeah, I love Fsharp, but the learning curve is huge. The wonderful part of it is that C# and VB and Fsharp, they can all talk to each other. So you can have a project with all these different solution with all these different projects in it, and they can all kind of talk to each other. So you can start to write more and more functional utility areas and start to learn a little bit more of functional programming, and that story of those two talking to each other is getting better over time.
Okay, great.
But still, I do worry that C# is trying to do a little bit too much in the functional department, as much as I want it to do more. So I'm very conflicted personally on this.
Understood. You're of two minds about it. You want it to go farther and faster, and also want to hold it back. Like, whoa, teaching these students is going to be a lot harder because of this.
Well, I mean, we have a diversity problem in C# and .NET communities. I think there's been a growing conversation about that, and I think a big part of that is going to be accessibility, and what can we do to improve the accessibility of our languages and our tools. VS Code is wonderful, but we still need to work on these compiler errors. We still need to work on the documentation pages are great, but they're not really readable to a beginner. The beginner looks at them and sees tables and walls of text and all these things that they don't know about, and their eyes gloss over. I love the documentation. I've contributed to the documentation, but we have an accessibility problem, and I'm not certain what the solution is.
Is there a language where you've seen the docs and you feel like they're doing a better job of being more accessible?
I have enjoyed the documentation around Vue.js as I've been doing that. The documentation of Angular is pretty good as well. The little that I've looked at Go has been okay. So I think a lot of these newer ones are definitely understanding this. And they need to fuel adoption, but I'm not as I'm not certain what the cure is for these older ones, because they're powerful and they're wonderful, but they're not necessarily accessible.
Okay, it's good to note. It's important to think on, and I'm sure that other people are thinking on it very hard as well.
I'm sure.
But it's a very important thing to make as software becomes more and more important, as it has for the past 20, 30, 40, 60 years, then it becomes more and more important to make it accessible to nearly everyone. So that's a challenge that we're all going to continue to face, I imagine. So we've talked about C#9. We've talked about some of the shifts in the language and what it means for those who are trying to learn the language. We've actually touched a little bit on Fsharp. Is there any more you want to say about that and kind of some of the features that have been brought in from Fsharp, or have we mostly covered that?
We've covered a lot of that. The one thing that I really want to see added on, as much as it would complicate things even more, is discriminated unions. And I see I see whispers that we're starting to. I know that we have things like I'm blanking on the name. The functional extensions, the language extensions library, languages ext. They've offered option, and they've offered somewhat discriminated union type syntax with generics. The option one I think is a little bit better. The discriminated unions, you have to remember the order every time you use it. Discriminated union, by the way, it's sort of like an enum with state. So
Okay.
think about a playing card game. You might have
Mhm.
a card discriminated union where you would have uh, a fighter or a monster kind of thing, and they might have a hit points and a magic spell, and you might have like a land kind of a thing, and it might have a some sort of an effect that it would give you every turn, or you might have uh, some sort of a spell card, and it would have some sort of an effect that could be immediately invoked. A
Mhm.
discriminated union would be able to force the compiler to recognize that in a switch statement and be able to act on all three of those.
Recognize all of those types
Yes.
in one variable,
Yes.
and then the compiler would be aware of that.
Yeah, it's aware of it. It matches it in what's called a match expression, which is a lot like a switch.
Mhm.
Um, and the compiler really forces you to handle all these cases. The thing the things I love about F# and functional programming are that if your program compiles, it's much more likely to properly work than in a traditional object-oriented language. That was the selling point for me to understand that. And we can get into currying and all these crazy things and partial application of functions. You don't necessarily need all of that to start to get a lot of the benefits from functional programming. So
Mhm.
discriminated union is something I'd like to see a little bit more royal support for in .NET. Um,
Mhm.
and
It's the yeah, I definitely get that with the with functional languages where it's giving you more guarantees
Yes.
just with the compile.
Hmm.
I think one of the examples is the null reference exceptions, where a lot of functional languages have those
Yep.
because they don't handle nulls in the same way. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's the option type that we're talking about. It could be either
Hmm.
some value or it could be none.
Hmm.
And I see whispers that both of these things are starting to get more royally into .NET, and
Hmm.
so C#'s 8 handling of nulls is a huge step in the right direction on that front too.
Definitely. And so, have you written? So we're talking about C#8.
Mhm.
Have you worked with code bases that are using that functionality, and does it make things easier?
I've written side projects in that,
Okay.
and it does,
Okay.
but you have to deliberately go after it. It's one
Hmm.
of those things you have to opt into right now.
I imagine
And
for Greenfield, that's a lot easier than Brownfield.
yes, but even for brownfield, you can enable it in your project settings, and then use basically I think region statements or some sort of a preprocessor or directive to say, hey, for this class, use the new C# null reference model where you have to explicitly check for null, and the compiler will yell at you if you don't. Um,
Mm,
and so you can start to say like, hey, I'm gonna flip this on for the code base, but any new file I want you to add in this pragma, or um, only the old files are going to get this pragma to turn it off for them, or something like
gotcha.
that. So
Yes, that makes sense.
they did think about like this kind of a gradual migration strategy. It's just not as featured in the tools yet, but hopefully Visual Studio 2021, which I'm assuming is coming next year, will make that a little bit more prominent.
That's great. Yeah, I know. So that does seem to me to be perhaps one area where it could be easier for beginners, where they don't have to deal with those null reference exceptions as much. Because
Yep.
I know for me, as learning, that was infuriating, and just what do you mean it's null? I don't understand, and then trying to figure out where that comes from,
Yeah.
stuff like that.
Yeah.
So.
It's an exciting time. I just starting to look more at these longer term patterns. The longer I stay in .NET, the longer I
Mm.
spend focusing on mentoring.
Mhm.
But it's certainly an exciting time to be a developer, and specifically a .NET developer.
Absolutely. I guess, would you say, so talking about all the changes to the language, C# is changing, it's becoming more functional, adding a lot of features. Would you say that's similar in ways to the kind of the JavaScript revolution that has occurred since ES6 came out back in 2015?
In what way similar? Can you clarify a little bit
So
more?
it's making, I think, a lot of complexity to the language. So a lot of stuff that didn't exist before now exists. Spread operator, for
Yeah.
instance, or classes in JavaScript, for that matter.
Yeah.
Fat arrows. We never had fat arrows, in before
Yeah.
ES6. So.
So yeah, I've been doing JavaScript in some form or another since the web came around, but I
Mhm.
didn't like it until ES6.
Okay.
and I actually had to learn JavaScript, like modern JavaScript, through TypeScript.
Mm-hmm.
In Angular. And once I learned TypeScript and all these things, it's like, okay, well, I can use all these new features, via Babel and all those fun things.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like, okay, well, I can also look at JavaScript without the TypeScript annotations. And yeah, like it is a modernization there, but I think there's less baggage.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have a framework that we're dealing with. We have browsers and how they interpret things, but that's getting
Okay.
standard as WebKit is, just ruling everything right now.
Right. So true.
So you have to worry about let constant var, but that's one specific thing.
Mm-hmm.
You get older things that work with prototype, but that's an isolated concept. It doesn't feel like as much baggage to me because we had all these different browsers who all had their own interpretations, and you had to kind of play to the center to everything that was supported by everything. So it doesn't feel like as much baggage, but there's probably some relation there. It's just not as large of a scale.
Excellent. That's a good call. I definitely see where you're going with that. So, can most people take advantage of the new C# features? Is there a lot of upgrading that you have to do to, for instance, libraries that you're referencing or things like that in order to take advantage of some of these new C# features?
The C#9 features are, I believe, only .NET 5 right now. I'm not certain on that, but everything I'm reading says says .NET 5, which should come this fall or winter,
Okay.
I suppose. So pretty soon now. So that's exciting. The C# 8 and 7.3 and 6, those are things that you should be able to take advantage of in most code bases.
Okay.
You should be able to just, as long as you can be able to upgrade to .NET Framework 4.8 or some version of .NET Core, you should be
You
fine.
don't have to be on .NET Core. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yep, because I was able to use a lot of that stuff on .NET Framework code bases.
Okay.
Now .NET 5, like, yeah, you kind of have to be you kind of have to be latest and greatest, but I believe that Microsoft has a pretty good migration strategy for .NET Core to .NET 5.
Okay. What about .NET 4.8 to .NET 5? Is that
that depends a lot more. Usually you're talking about ASP.NET and what things are you dropping? Are you might be using web forms and things like that, which there is no good migration path that I know of for those other than
I can't run my web forms app on .NET 5. Come on, you're killing me.
Well, now you're touching on why I like to use JavaScript frameworks for the front-end on .NET applications.
Fair.
No, this is an area I don't know as much about as I would like to, but I know there's tons of great content coming out on .NET 5. So I would encourage you to look at all these other sources out there.
Excellent. And so is C#9 finished? Is it released? Where are we with that?
I believe it's tied to .NET 5, so it should come with that. Is my
okay. But I assume they're not changing the features much at this point. No. It's going to be
no. We look to be ready to go.
Excellent. Okay. Cool. What else would you like? Should we talk about new stuff or exciting stuff? Is there anything with C#10 that we should bring up, or is that not even on the horizon yet?
C#10 yet. I'm still waiting to play with my records and with statements.
Oh yeah.
But I'm excited to see. I'm always excited to see what comes next. Usually we tend to know about the spring what's going to be in those, but we'll see.
Cool. Yeah, I know. I'm excited about records. I think that is a fantastic feature that really will make a lot of programming easier and less error prone.
Yeah.
And make it easier to write code in a more immutable way.
Yeah.
So.
And I think just it's this gradual shift of thinking about things as in chaining from one operation to another, even if it's in an imperative programming model like C# normally is, chaining them together with LINQ and things like that. So I'm excited to see where it goes.
Excellent. Anything else that you'd like to discuss around this topic? Or
I think that's it for me.
Okay, very cool. I've really enjoyed this. If people have questions or they want to follow you on social media, is there somewhere they should reach out?
Yeah, probably the best place to get started with me is either connect with me on LinkedIn or probably more preferably Twitter at integerman is my Twitter handle.
Excellent. Okay, we'll make sure to put that in the notes for the video. Well, thank you so much, Matt. It's really been a pleasure, and I hope that you have a great night.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks.